Hi students, this is Mr. Eckert and we're going to go through the last set of targets in this cells unit, and all of these targets have to do with energy, and now energy transfers and is captured and released in living organisms and living cells. And I know you remember that the very first target that you learned in biology, which was characteristics of all living things. And you know that all living things have a metabolism, and a metabolism is the set of all chemical reactions that have to do with energy. So all living things need energy. Some of you said all living things eat, and probably a better 10th grade answer would be all living things need energy. So they process energy, and as they do so, they need to replace that energy. And so these set of targets have to do with how living things replace that lost energy that they need for their cells. So it's a set of 4 targets that you can see here. Actually, the first one says that you can write out the correct formula, the correct chemical equation for photosynthesis and respiration, and you'll see that that's actually divided up into 2 different targets. But you know, all of our energy that we get on Earth comes indirectly or directly, of course, from the sun. So that sun energy radiates towards the earth and is captured, some of it anyway, by producers, what we call producers, on earth. And then that energy is then transferred to primary consumers, which of course eat the producers, and then to secondary consumers, which eat the primary consumers. Now, of course, that in this diagram it ends there, but you probably realize there could be possibly a tertiary consumer or even a 4th level consumer. But in this diagram, we're only going to secondary consumer. So again, this target C17 says that you should be able to write out the correct reactants end products in the photosynthesis and respiration reaction. You're going to actually see the respiration reaction in a later target. So what is photosynthesis? I know you've heard about photosynthesis, learned a little bit about it in previous science classes, but for biology, you want to think of it as a chemical reaction that happens in cells that changes light energy into chemical energy in the form of glucose. And glucose is, of course, a sugar. So the goal of photosynthesis is to produce glucose. Glucose is considered stored energy because that's the molecule then that is going to be broken down in order to get usable energy. And plants break glucose down to get usable energy. You and I break glucose down to get usable energy. All living things pretty much break down glucose to get usable energy. You might ask the question, well, why do plants photosynthesize? Why don't they just use the light energy, since that is a form of energy? Why do they take the time and energy to turn it into sugar or glucose? And if you think about that for a little bit, you might come up with some good answers. Well, one, the sunlight's not available all the time, right? So there are parts of the 24-hour day when the sunlight is not available. Also, if you think about it, especially where we live, in many parts of the world, plants go into a dormant phase in the winter time. If there is a winter, not all places have a winter season, but if there is a winter season, then plants often are dormant. In fact, many plants in our part of North America lose their photosynthetic organs. They lose their leaves. So during the wintertime, they can't photosynthesize, so they have to rely on the stored up energy. And that stored energy is in the form of glucose. So here's the formula. The target says that you have to be able to write this out. And you need to be able to write it out either in the top in terms of the chemical symbols, or you can write it out in terms of the words. But if you look here, what's to the left of the arrow in any chemical reaction is known as the reactants. These are the things that the plant is using. And look at what it says. It's using water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight. Then to the right of the arrow, now whenever you see an arrow in a chemical equation, it means yields or produces. So the plant uses water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight to yield or produce glucose, and this is the chemical formula for glucose, plus oxygen atoms. Okay, so on the right of the arrow, these are the products. This is what comes out of the photosynthesis reaction. To the left of the arrow, these are the reactants, what goes in. These are what the plant uses. Now, you can memorize this, but if you just look at it and ask yourself a couple of questions. Okay, when you think about photosynthesis and what living things photosynthesize, of course you're going to think plants. Plants photosynthesize. So then ask yourself another question. Well, you give your mother, let's say, a plant, some flowers for her birthday. Well, what are they going to need to survive? Well, obviously, they're going to need water and they're going to need light. Now they're going to need a gas. Now some of you will recognize and remember, oh yeah, plants use carbon dioxide. So that you're going to, this is pretty obvious. Plants need water, plants need light. But you're going to have to remember that plants also need carbon dioxide. And what do they make with those? Well, you probably learned in 5th grade, plants make oxygen. That's why we like having plants around, right? But this is really the main goal here of photosynthesis. Plants make glucose. Okay, so that's the formula. Again, you can remember it in terms of those words for a test purpose or the chemical formula in terms of the symbols that you see above. Now, light, of course, is a main ingredient. And white light is a combination of all the colors in the visible light spectrum. What do I mean by that? All the colors in the visible light spectrum. Well, down here, in fact, I'm guessing that many of you saw a Bill Nye video on light, and you learned this fact here, that white light is made up of these colors, and you can remember the guy's name, Roy G. Biv, to give you all the colors that make up white light. So there's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet that make up white light. Those colors of light blend together to make up white light, the light that comes from the sun. It says visible light ranges in wavelengths from about 400 nm, that stands for nanometers, to about 700 nanometers, which is red on the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, the smaller the wavelength, the more energy that form of light is carrying. So the violet light is actually carrying the most energy, whereas the red is carrying the least. So as that light energy is absorbed by the plant can then use that energy and change it into stored energy in the form of glucose. And how does it do that? Well, plants have different pigments in them. I'm sure you all know that plants have the pigments chlorophyll. Actually, there's two different kinds of chlorophyll. There's a chlorophyll A and a chlorophyll B, but they contain other pigments as well. And these pigments will absorb certain wavelengths, certain colors of that white light, and then reflect all the others. So this red heart at the right of the screen, it is absorbing. The whole reason that you and I can see that red heart is because white light is, now in this case, of course, if it's emanating from your computer screen, your screen is actually giving off light. But if it was projected, let's say, onto a screen in the classroom, white light would be hitting it, bouncing off of that area, and all of those Roy G. Biv colors in the white light would be absorbed by those pigments, and the red is the color that's being reflected back into your eye, and that's why we see it as red. So this works with all different kinds of colors. If you see something that's green, of course most plants are green, right? Well, that's because the chlorophyll is absorbing the Roy G. Biv colors and reflecting basically green back to our eyes, and that's why it appears green. So there we go. The orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet are being absorbed, and the red is reflected. So where does photosynthesis take place? Well, most of it takes place in the oceans because most of it occurs in algae, and algae are one of a major kind of what's called a protozoan. So all plants will photosynthesize. Some protozoans, those being algae, will photosynthesize, And a few bacteria will photosynthesize. Those are called cyanobacteria. And some of you know that cyan is actually a color. So cyanobacteria can photosynthesize. So why is photosynthesis important? Well, to autotrophs or producers, and those are synonyms, that's how they get their energy. That's how they replace their lost energy. They do photosynthesis to store that light energy and meet their energy requirements. To heterotrophs or consumers, of course, we get glucose by eating the autotrophs and or by eating other heterotrophs, and that's how we get our glucose, which we're then later going to break down into a usable form of energy. So the glucose is stored energy, and it will later be broken down into usable energy. So that's it for that target. If you have any questions, please make sure you ask.